I was born in Harrogate and educated in Harrogate, and when I was 13, my father had a camera shop in Halifax, and we came to live in Bradford. So I grew up in Bradford from the age of 13. So from my current age, that gives me sort of well over half a century of involvement with the industry in Bradford and with the Jewish community. My ancestors came over in the 30s from the pogroms in Russia and settled in London. And my grandfather, Louis, was a violinist. And he used to play in the silent theatres, you know, when they used to have an orchestra in the silent theatres. And he became quite a famous band leader. Nikolas, who was 2.5 years younger than me, he died when he was only in his mid-50s. The family don't live to ripe old ages. But Nikolas was, in his day, a very well-known actor. Did a number of very well-known television series, principally the Strauss Family, another one called The Days of Hope, and was a little short of a prodigy, and he did extremely well. He was very well known, and then he got bored with acting and became a director. And he was a director in London, the National Theatre, and then went to do various directing jobs in South Africa and elsewhere. And then in later years he became very unwell for one reason and another, and he spent his time then as a teacher, an acting teacher, and he was the head of drama at the second biggest acting school in the UK, and died tragically some years ago. I was actually bar mitzvah in Harrogate Synagogue, and as I said, my father's business took him to Halifax, and I was very active insofar as one could be active in the Harrogate community, Jewish community. I was a very enthusiastic member of Habonim, not a very good Jewish student, and I don't think I did my bar mitzvah terribly well. But when we came to live in Bradford, really everything changed, because Harrogate had a very small Jewish community, and it was a very opulent Jewish community. Our family was probably one of the poorest families in the town, and we came to live in Bradford, and it was in my early teens like moving to a different planet. Harrogate it then was a very, very small, rural, undeveloped place. There were hardly any cars, and it was very quiet, sleepy little town, nowhere near the very fashionable upmarket town it is today. So when I came to live in Bradford with my parents, it was, as I say, a culture shock of the highest order, not least of which I was immediately taken into the bosom of a big, thriving, wonderful Jewish community. My father was never very religious and not really interested in his religion at all. My mother a lot more so. But we immediately joined the Bowland Street Synagogue because my parents developed some friendships there. And that was so much nicer than the Orthodox, I thought at that time, because a lot of the service was in English. Everybody was very, very friendly. The rabbi at that time was Rabbi Dr. Beenheim. And that synagogue was the one that was established by Ozzie Stroud's father. And the Strouds were there. That's probably where I first got friendly with Richard and his friends. But we were immediately, my brother and I, involved in a big Jewish community. I mean, we felt very rarefied when we were in Harrogate. I was the only Jew in the whole of my school until my brother came along, and then he was the second one, and then there was one little girl. So it was a big primary school, St. Peter's, and there were 3 Jewish kids in it. And I used to get called Dirty Jew and Fatso and God knows what, but I must say, never seemed to really upset me. And I did very badly at school. And when we came to, I failed my 11 plus, but when I came to Bradford, I was one of the first pupils at Rhodesway Comprehensive School, which again absolutely changed my life. The most wonderful headmaster, Clifford Sims, and the most wonderful sort of vibrant group of people, not many Jewish people there either. So I had this big comprehensive school that I was part of and did well there, and then I was part of this big Jewish community, and really those were the most formative influences of my life. But the Bradford Jewish community in those days was Eastern European, and principally in the textile industry. They weren't manufacturers as such, they were mostly middlemen of one sort or another, but they were all much more liberal than the traditional conservative Orthodox Jews, much more easygoing, very friendly, very warm-hearted. They made my parents incredibly welcome. They had a social life that they'd never had before, and they were always very, very nice to me. And it played a very, very formative part of my life. I subsequently became the treasurer of Boland Street Synagogue in later years when I'd established my business, so I kept that going. I also gave a lot of money to it, indirectly. I personally paid for it all to be redecorated as it is today. That all was paid for by me, and done by me, and I did that many, many years ago. And I love that synagogue, and I still love it. And I think for it to disappear because of the declining community as a building would be a great loss. Today, I have principally a property business. We run serviced office businesses. We've got 67 serviced offices that we rent out on various terms here and in the Birstall area. But I started off with one shop, this one up here, when I was about 24, 25, with money that I'd earned myself as a trainee at Marks and Spencer, and it was called Super Simon. Everybody laughed at the name, but they remembered it. And my business career developed from that one business. My business career has principally been two big lumps. One's retail and one's textiles. And I started off in textiles in the early 60s. I started off my retail business in the early 60s, and I moved into the textile trade probably about 10 years later, in the probably mid-70s. And I developed a chain of shops, several chains of shops, tobacconists, supermarkets. We had 30-odd different retail businesses. And I was very much involved in the Bradford Jewish community and knew everybody, been there for obviously many years, and became very friendly with quite a lot of the other younger Jewish guys, the Jeromes and the Strouds principally, all of which I counted amongst my very, very good friends. And the main influence was Richard Stroud. Richard and I became very close friends, as did our wives, and in our early married years. And Richard introduced me into the world of textile manufacturing, which I've always been interested in, but never have any history in it as such. In the probably mid-70s, I took a controlling interest in the what was then Stroud Riley Drummond business. Really not knowing what on earth I was doing, but I'd made quite a lot of money in the retail business, and Richard and I thought it would be good fun to see if we could take over a public company and see what we could do with it. And I bought a controlling stake from the Selker family, and became the principal shareholder and chief executive at that time.
You talked about the Bradford businessmen, the Jewish businessmen, and I can think of the time you were active there. I can think of people like Lord Kagan and
Who was a
Waxman.
Great Jewish businessman. Albert, great Jewish businessmen. The Jerome family, the Stroud family, in their time, they were pioneers and created here. And the Jerome family, they were also great businessmen, and they brought a lot of prosperity through the textile industry to the town. But of course, that's now gone, principally. But in its heyday, these guys were very, very important to the local economy. They came over already in business, most of them, but they saw what was happening with the Nazis and felt. But even before the rise of the Nazis, a lot of the sort of middle class Jewish merchant types had already come over, and there was I think the Bradford Jewish community goes back many years before that. But at that time, I think it flowered, and that will have been at the time I came over at its peak. And there was, as I say, a very big community, and a lovely community as well. I think it would be probably wrong not to talk about my auntie, Ruth Simmonds, who, this is really testing my brain cell, whose maiden name was Eager, and the Eagers founded the under the direction of, you know all about this, I presume. This was where Albert Waxman and a number of other young Jewish men escaped the Nazis, and they had a hostel, and that was run by Mr. and Mrs. Eager. Mr. and Mrs. Eager had a son and a daughter. The daughter was Ruth, who was my auntie. She married my uncle, Geoffrey. And that hostel that's a film. There is a film about that.
It's on YouTube.
Pardon?
It's on YouTube.
Yeah. Well, Ruth was very, very much part of that, as her parents were. And that all the men from the hostel, I think there were about a dozen, I think they all became hugely successful. One business or another. Not all of them, but most of them, which Albert's probably the best example. Well, as I say, it was a very friendly, somewhat hierarchical community. I think the Reform Synagogue, Bowland Street, were probably looked upon in some respects as poor relations to the Orthodox Jewish community, where all the big mill owners were, and the more opulent, more established Ashkenazi families. But there was a bit of friendly rivalry, but never anything other than that. And everybody knew everybody. It was a very close-knit, lovely community. We even had at one time our own Jewish shop in Bradford. There was a butcher's shop at one point. That was before my time, actually. I know there was a Jewish shop on Manningham Lane, and they had bagels every Sunday morning. And it was very nice, and they had a lot of social activities. The Hebrew University was the most famous activity. It raised many tens of thousands of pounds for cancer research at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I was very much involved in that for many years. It had a great social occasion every year. They had a big dinner and dance at the Midland Hotel. And it was a wonderful place, a wonderful community. But then, of course, it shrank, as so many Jewish communities have, and is now in terminal decline. I stayed a member even when I moved to live in Leeds, and I joined the Reform there. And I never actually left it. I think I probably stopped paying my subscriptions a few years ago, but I remained a member for many years, really out of goodwill. My religious life and my life in the Jewish community was transferred to Leeds, where again we've had a very nice time. We had a lovely part of a lovely big community in Leeds, and my daughters grew up in Leeds, but of course they now live in London, all three of them, with their families, as do so many other young Jewish people. I greatly mourn the fact that Bradford, as a great and I really do mean great, Jewish community is now effectively died off. And there were some wonderful characters, some great businessmen, and they were responsible, I think, in no small part for the prosperity of Bradford for many years. And I think it's not telling anybody anything that isn't obvious, but the economy in Bradford has gone down dramatically in recent years. They used to say that Bradford had more Rolls Royces per capita than anywhere else in the country, and I think that's honestly quite true. The Orthodox synagogue is nice enough in its own way, I suppose, but it's nowhere near as historic as Boland Street, and I hope that sustains itself. So I'm very grateful to Bradford and very grateful to the Bradford Jewish community. And of course, the Bradford Jewish community centred around that synagogue was hugely successful. Very, very great businessmen there were within that communities, and sadly all gone. So I don't know what will happen to that. Just know that it's intrinsically very, very important. It was nominated, I think, as a heritage site, and turning into some form of museum or a place where people can go and see probably some of the stuff that went on in Bradford in those years. They were wonderful years.